Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another historical humans heritage. And on today's episode, we are going to Mauritius, whatever it's called. I'm really bad at names,
Maurit-
but
Mauritius. If you are from Mauritius, please tell us how to say your country's name. Please save us from ourselves.
yes. Anyways, one of the coolest things about it is this is a site where the British went through an entire reinvention, a retooling of some of their previous ways, because after the British government completely outlawed slavery, they had to figure out a new way to try and get around the system.
Yep. Hence the construction of the Aapravasi Ghat district of Port Louis out here on this lovely little island. And oh boy.
Yeah. Because what they did was they retooled the island from being a slave encampment to being an indentured servant encampment.
Yep. From 1834 to 1920, they went through about 500,000 indentured laborers, heavy air quotes on that,
Yeah.
that were brought in from places like India to willingly and freely work these sugar plantations. This was part of a endeavor known by the British as the Great Experiment, and the idea was to see if you could replace slavery with some other form of free labor, because that definitely is a thing that exists.
It's not slave labor if you sign them to a contract and then refuse to ever let them fill out the terms and conditions of the contract. No, no, no. It's just business practices at that point. And that, I
Yeah.
think, is one of the important things about indentured servitude that most people don't really talk to, is the fact that indentured servitude, what you do is you basically say, oh, you want transportation to, let's say, the Americas, to the New World, or you want to go to Australia? Sure, just sign this contract, and in 5 easy years, you could have your freedom. All it'll cost is 2,000 pounds. And then you come to find out you make like 2 cents a day, and you will never make that 2,000 pounds ever. You're
Yeah.
basically just a slave with extra steps. It really is sad.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about this system was that the British did it in part to prove to the world that slavery itself was outdated, and that the act of enslavement being so unnecessarily cruel actually reduced productivity on your plantations. This was sort of Britain trying to say, "Hey everybody, maybe we should stop being the worst people in human history."
And instead, we will be the worst people in human history, but with extra steps. I'm not
Yeah.
going to let them off on this. This is. I
Yeah.
just hate that they called it an experiment because in reality, that's not
Yeah.
at all what this is. And this is an island off the coast of Madagascar, by the way, for those of you unaware. It's right off the shores of Africa in the Indian Ocean. But it
Yeah.
is one of the ways in which the British tried to maintain their systems and maintain their
Mhm.
productivity, but without actually changing anything.
Yeah. And a big part of this system with Aapravasi got here is this compound over its 86-year run saw something to the tune of 2 million people pass through it.
Oh,
A number of them were not settled here. About only about 500,000 would stay in Mauritius. The other 1.5 million got shuffled around to places like Australia and
India.
parts of Africa.
Oh yeah. Well, people came from India, Eastern Africa, Madagascar, China, and Southeast Asia to work as a part of it. And yeah, the fact that this continued until 1920, though, like we talk about the establishment of slavery, and people like to say, oh, it was generations ago. 1920 wasn't all that long ago. That was 104 years ago from current time. But in
Yeah.
reality, That's someone's grandparents. That's someone's great grandparents. That's not that far off.
Yeah, and it's one of the interesting things too is that it stops in 1920, almost like there was something going on in 1918 that had completely diminished the British people's ability to continue doing this. Um, anything at all. Franz Ferdinand, we salute you.
Oh no. Oh. Yeah, World War One changed a lot of how colonies are viewed and perceived, and the sad part is, a lot of World War One, the ending wasn't the end of colonialism, as a lot of people like to assume or think. Realistically, that was World War Two for a lot of it. I mean,
Yeah,
it's very
yeah,
hard to let go of a cash cow like this, where you have very little in terms of labor costs, and that keeps the overall bottom line down. And
yeah.
this is a an interesting perspective because this site is very well maintained. It is very
Oh, yeah.
much in the same condition that it was originally in. I mean, it went through a renovation in I think 1864 and 1865, but it is still
Yeah, yeah.
pretty well preserved.
About half of the original property as it was by the end of the American Civil War is still standing, which that's a very good chunk, especially given the fact that Aapravasi Ghat is the last standing example of this system and of the 2 million person diaspora that it caused. Like, this is the last standing set of buildings for shuffling people around for the quote unquote free labor service.
Yeah, it's they're not enslaved. They signed up for the contracts, but it still doesn't mean you're a good person. And it's just another legacy remnant of that system and of that area. And it really is sad to see because this was just entirely a system built to exploit people from lower economic standing and what we would now perceive as potentially second or third world countries.
Yeah.
And it's sad, but this is kind of a cool thing about it is how it's preserved and the fact that it is a UNESCO site. I mean, we talk about this a lot, and I specifically hammer on this because I think historic preservation is a vitally important thing of a lot of times people are like, well, we should stop learning about this because it's a tragic past, or we should not talk about this because it's traumatic. And there is a certain validity to having these sites and to having these conversations and to have these dialogues. I mean, this site, while it's properly in place, like you mentioned, over what, a million people, half a million people came through these
Yeah.
doors.
2 million came through, half a million stayed.
Yeah, so that's a large amount of people, and you're talking about the mid 1800s through the 20th century. Like,
Yeah.
that's a lot, and it's very, very important. And the site itself is actually fairly well protected because it's actually owned by the Ministry of Arts and Culture, and it's protected under a National Heritage Act, and it has a specific trust fund that are specifically there to help maintain it. And they have buffer zones there. They have day-to-day
Yeah.
management
And
plans.
and honestly, the buffer zone is the one weakness of this site's preservation, as there are parts of it that are rather poorly defined and thus are subsequently able to be exploited into, well, I already built it here, oh well, kind of developments. So there is a parts of the buffer zone that can very easily be encroached on by unscrupulous investors. Which, let's be honest, we live in late stage capitalism; those are everywhere.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's very well preserved, and it should be. It is the first and the last standing site for this chapter of human history that, let's be honest, no one ever talks about.
No, because we talk about the North Atlantic slave trade. We talk about the transatlantic slave trade, not North Atlantic. I'm
Yeah, yeah,
still
North Atlantic.
U-boat
No,
brained from the shorts,
yeah,
but
it's just no
um, but
alternate history.
But oh no. But it is something that we don't talk about is the indentured servitude, and admittedly, Britain wasn't the only one who did it. America got a lot of their Chinese and Irish laborers through indentured servitude.
Yeah, yeah. This became a global system. It started with the British at Aapravasi Ghat in 1834, and Aapravasi Ghat is the last standing center for this trade, and that can't be emphasized enough. That not only was it the first, but it's also the only one that remains. Because the rest kind of got torn down with the system.
Yeah, and especially with a lot of revisionist and a lot of
Well,
it's a double-edged
also
sword.
it's a port. These all have to be in ports. If you're not using part of the port, what are you doing, right? You tear that down, repurpose it. That's just the way things tend to go.
Well, that's definitely a part of it is redevelopment, but then you have revisionist history where a lot of times when sites are there and they don't make the controlling power look the best, they'll demolish it, they'll try to build something else in its place. Or you see these repressed populations finally stand up, and when they stand up, can you guess what some of the first targets tend to be? I mean, we see this a lot with slave revolts, especially in Africa specifically. But they tend to burn down the building that seems to be oppressing them. And I think rightfully so. And this is just kind of an interesting one. I mean, not very often talked about, not very often exposed. I didn't know about this site until we actually discovered it during our research. So it's an interesting one for everyone to learn about too. But do you have anything additional to add, or should we wrap up?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to end it. This is very interesting site from a very interesting part of history that, like, I'm be honest with you, I didn't even know about the Great Experiment until I read about it researching this site here. So that is always it's always fun to know more and a little bit shameful that so much is not taught.
Yeah, like I know for me specifically, I knew about the indentured servitude. I knew that replaced slavery as a whole. I just one didn't realize it went until the 1920s, and two didn't realize just how much the British pivoted, but also didn't. Like, ah, yes, good chap, we outlawed slavery. Well, then what's he doing here? Ah, that is a servant. He signed a contract. It's all fine. We're good. Does he know how to
Yes.
read English? I didn't think that was a part of the contract.
Don't worry, there's a limitation here somewhere about how much I can physically hurt him.
No death, and that's pretty much about it. And on that note,
Yay.
thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next one, and let us know what your thoughts are down below. Peace.